This is my pool table. It's older than me and it's pretty worn out. It still plays just fine, but the felt is in pretty rough condition, so I wanted to get it redone. And I wasn't about to spend $300+ to have someone else do it, so I recovered it myself, and it was much easier than I thought. In this video, I'm going to bring you along as I take this table apart and install new felt on the top as well as the rail. I'll be going step by step showing you exactly how I did it, and that it's really not as difficult as everyone said. That being said, I want to start off by saying that this is my first time doing this. I did watch quite a few videos on how to do it though, so in my mind, I'm basically a professional, but even then, this still may not be exactly the right way to do it. So go ahead and let me know everything I did wrong in the comments. Anyway, to start this off, I measured the table and bought the correct size of felt. Now, there's a bunch of different brands and colors you can choose, as well as two different types of felt, traditional felt and worsted fabric. And if you don't know the difference, basically traditional felt is fuzzy and worsted fabric is smooth. Balls roll faster on worsted fabric and it also lasts longer, but both have the same install process, and traditional felt is more forgiving. Traditional felt is also a quarter the price of worsted fabric, so as this is my first time doing this, I opted to go for traditional felt. This is the AccuPlay felt and I bought it on Amazon. Link in description. It isn't the cheapest felt I could find, but it has great reviews and it's still relatively inexpensive at just over $100. They have felt for 7, 8, 9 foot tables as well as multiple colors to choose from. And this brand comes with 6 pre-cut pieces for the rails, which saves the hassle of cutting them yourself. The fabric is also extra stretchy, which made the install super easy. Anyway, next I gathered up a few tools. We're gonna need a scraper, a knife or scissors, then a flathead and some pliers to pull out staples, then a pencil and a tape measure, 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch staples along with a stapler. And I'd highly recommend a pneumatic or battery powered stapler here, but this worked just fine. We'll also need a screw gun to disassemble the table, then some sort of fabric puller like this, and then something to hold the fabric down. On my table, I use this 3M high strength 90 contact adhesive. This is a spray on adhesive. It comes in this can and you're only going to need one of these. You can also use 3M 75, but this stuff is stronger. You could also use a regular contact adhesive that you have to roll on, which after refelting a table is probably what I would recommend just because it would be a bit less messy. And if you do use the spray adhesive, you're also going to want some painter's tape along with some cardboard to cover up the table. Anyway, let's get started, and I'll be using a stopwatch to see how long it takes me. Step 1, remove the rails, and they're attached with these long screws around the outside of the table, and some tables do have them hidden behind trim. And once I took all those screws out, the rails came right off. And taking a look at the back of these, they already had numbers on them matching their placement at the table, which is a great idea because it'll make sure everything lines up when they're put back on. Anyway, next I detached the wood portion of the rail by unscrewing these screws on the side, and then these here that come from underneath the table. And this table also has this coin operated ball collection chamber, which I also had to remove to get to the rest of the screws. But luckily that was pretty easy. I just unlocked it and it slid right out. And now is a good time to mention that taking the wood portion of the rails off is not always necessary, and you'll only have to do this if it sits on top of the slate. In my case, it doesn't, but I wanted to clean out the ball return rails, and this also makes it a little easier to lift up the slate and recover. Anyway, once I took all the screws out, then I got some help and lifted the whole thing up and out of the way. Next, I slipped a 2x4 under the slate to use as a lever, and then I lifted it up and put another 2x4 in each corner to raise it up so I could remove the felt. And I found it best to lift it up in the center so it lifts up evenly. Anyway, once it was raised up, I began removing the old felt. Some people recommend taking it off in one piece so you can practice putting it back on before you use the new felt, but I wasn't planning on doing that, so I cut along the edges to make it easier to pull up. Also, I'm not quite sure what this second layer of fabric is that's under the felt, but I removed that as well. Anyway, the next step is to clean up the slate. You can see there's a bunch of glue around the perimeter, and I used this scraper here to scrape it all off. There was also a bunch of glue under the table, but I didn't bother with that. And then to finish off the disassembly process, I laid out the rails and removed all the old felt from those as well. For this, I used a flathead to pry up the staples, making sure not to damage the wood, and then I used a pair of pliers to finish removing. And some tables also have feather strips in the rails that you'll need to carefully pry out, but these only use staples. And there we go, the disassembly is complete, and quick update on the time, that took just about an hour. The next step is to put on the new felt. I started with the rails, and I just put a board over the slate and worked right on top of that. The fabric I bought is the same on both sides, so it didn't matter which side was down. I laid the rail on the fabric, making sure it was centered so there's enough overlap on each end, and with the top of the rail facing away from me. Then I pulled the fabric over the top of the rail and stapled it in using a 1/4 inch staple, and then I worked my way across the rail to the other side, stapling about every 2 inches. As I mentioned before, some rails have feather strips, and in that case, you'll put those in first. Anyway, I also pulled it lengthwise while stapling to make sure I pulled all the slack out. Pulling it too tight wouldn't be a big problem, but having it too loose would create wrinkles. Also, I spaced the staples a little bit too far, 1 inch would have been better, but I corrected that later. Anyway, once I made it to the other end, I flipped it over and started on the corner. This is a corner pocket corner, and to do this, I pulled on it pretty hard perpendicular from the diagonal part of the rail, and then put a couple staples in, trying to keep the wrinkles behind the staples so they don't show on the front. But I couldn't quite get it flat with how I pulled it, so I took those staples out and tried again. This time still pulling diagonally, but a bit more to the right, more even with the front rail. Then I stapled it in and put a couple staples in around the corner, again making sure to keep the wrinkles behind the staples, and that worked pretty well. Now, I couldn't find a clear video showing how to fold the felt on the backside, but I tried my best anyway. I continued to wrap the felt around the long part of the rail, pulled it tight, and stapled it down. And then I cut off the excess like this, and same thing with the end. I pulled the felt inwards a bit, kind of diagonally from one corner, and then stapled it in. Same thing with the other corner, just trying to pull it nice and tight towards the center so it doesn't show any wrinkles on the outside. And here I used quite a few 3/8 staples to make sure it wouldn't come undone. Anyway, I flipped it over and it looked pretty good, so I continued stapling it along the bottom edge, and I'm pulling it pretty tight here, a couple inches down from where I put the staple. And I was also pulling it lengthwise a bit to pull out the extra slack and make sure it stayed nice and tight. Then once I got close to the other end, I flipped it over and stapled it up exactly the same way. Once again, pull perpendicular to the corner, staple the long sides in place first, then cut off the excess, pull inwards a bit from both corners, put in a couple staples, and then pull straight back to get a nice clean edge and finish stapling it off. And finally, I pulled the last bit of fabric coming from the bottom side of the rail onto the back of the rail and stapled that off as well. There's the first rail complete. It's not perfect, but all the folds were hidden in the back, and the fronts and sides were nice and clean. The corner pocket ends were a little tricky, but after doing a couple of them, they went a bit faster. And I thought the side pocket ends were going to be more difficult, but assuming I did them correctly, I actually found them to be pretty easy. For these, I stapled the felt the same way all the way along the sides, but then I folded the felt over like this along the front vertical edge, trying to get it as tight as I could and trying to get that seam to start at the top corner of the rail straight back and over to the bottom of the rail. I put a couple staples in there and then I folded it back and tried to cut off some of the extra felt. I pulled it towards the center like before and finished stapling it off. It does look a bit odd to me having 3 layers of fabric on the corner, but from what I've seen, this is the correct way to do it. The last step on these is to make sure the holes are cut out on the backside, and I cut them extra big to make sure the fabric didn't interfere when it was time to install them. Anyway, I finished up all 6 rails and I'm actually pretty happy with how they turned out. The felt is all nice and tight. I think they look pretty good, but I also think I could have done a better job on the side pocket end. Anyway, quick check on the time. It shows about 3 hours, so the rails took just about 2 hours. The next step is to put the new felt onto the slate, and for this table, it needs to be glued down because there's no wood under the slate to staple to. That being said, it works the same way whether you're stapling or gluing. Alright, so first I made sure it was perfectly clean, so I wiped it down a couple times with a wet rag. It dried up pretty fast, and then I laid out the fabric. But there wasn't quite enough clearance under the slate to pull the felt tight, so I had to raise it up again. And once I had a couple more 2x4s under it, there was going to be plenty of room to pull it tight. Now, all the fabric and felts you can get are going to be a little bit different, and in order to stretch it out properly, I needed to find the stretch index for this specific fabric and this 8-foot table. And to do that, we'll choose one of the long sides of the table to be the anchor side, and the other side to be the stretch side. Now, on the anchor side, I lined up the fabric with the bottom edge of the slate because that's where I'm going to be gluing it down at, and then I centered it on both ends. Next, I placed a board on top and used 3 clamps to clamp it down really tight. And then straight across from that board, I pulled it as tight as I could just using my hands, and then I marked a line on the corner where it folds over the slate. And a second person would definitely be helpful here, but it's not necessary. Also, don't worry, this mark will be hidden by the rails. I pulled it tight a few more times to make sure that mark was in fact on the corner of the slate. Then I let the felt relax and measured from the edge of the slate to that mark. And for me, that number was 3 1/4 inches. Now we're going to take that number and subtract 3/4 inches. So the 3 1/4 inches minus the 3/4 inches is equal to 2.5 inches, which is going to be the stretch index for this specific fabric on this 8-foot table. And the reason for subtracting 3/4 inches is because when we stretch the felt widthwise, we don't want to stretch it fully because there needs to be a little bit of slack that'll get pulled out when it's pulled lengthwise. And you'll subtract that 3/4 inch regardless of table size or felt type. Anyway, next I marked out the felt, and first I did the side pocket. Starting with the pocket on the anchor side of the table, I measured out and marked 3/8 of an inch from each side. And on tables with more complete circle cutouts on the side, like this one here, you'll want to mark out 13/16 of an an inch on each side. In both cases, we're going to end up pulling the felt so those lines line up with the end of the pockets, and this will allow the felt to be stretched all the way around the corners and make them nice and smooth and wrinkle free. Anyway, I just marked the fabric on that side, and now I'm going to mark it on this side. This is the stretch side, and on this side I'll mark 1/4 inch from each side of the pocket. Or again, if the slate is the more full circle type, you'll double that and mark 3/8 of an inch on each side. I'm not sure why this side is marked less than the other one, but it is. Also, I made a little bit of a mistake here, and the fabric wasn't laying completely flat when I marked it out, and that would have threw off my measurements a little bit and caused me to have a little bit of extra felt in the pocket, but luckily I did catch it later and remark it. Anyway, then I took the ruler and set it to my calculated stretch index of 2.5 inches and marked that in line with the 1/4 inch marks. And I also transferred those 1/4 inch marks up to make it easier to line up later. Here's a better look at that, and that second mark on the right side is the mess up I was talking about earlier. Anyway, to finish laying it out, I marked 2.5 inches every couple inches on the stretch side, as well as I also marked that on one of the short sides. But thinking back, I should have also marked it on the other short side because the table length is double its width, so it'll stretch out that same 2.5 inches on both ends. And it also would have been helpful to use a straight edge and connect the lines all the way down. And I wasn't paying attention and almost marked too close to the corner pockets. You're going to want to keep your lines back about 4 inches or so, otherwise they might show when you stretch it out. Anyway, the next step is securing it down, and the anchor side goes first. Of course, I'm using spray glue here because it's just solid slate and there's nothing to staple to, so I put a couple pieces of cardboard on top of the felt to catch any overspray, and then I folded it over the cardboard and sprayed 3 coats right onto the edge. And I put 3 coats on the edge of the slate as well to get the best adhesion. And you're supposed to let it sit for 2 to 3 minutes so it gets tacky, so that's what I did. And then I folded it over and lined up the 2 lines I drew before with the edges of the slate. And of course, I also lined up the edge of the fabric with the bottom edge of the slate. Next, I moved over to one of the corner pockets and kind of pulled the felt horizontally to the right. Not enough to stretch it, but just enough to pull the slack out. And then I stuck it down and worked my way back to the center, making sure the edge of the felt lined up with the bottom of the slate. And then I pressed that side down to make sure it was nice and tight. Next, I moved over to the other corner pocket and did the exact same thing. And as I mentioned before, if your slate has a backer board to staple to, then the felt goes on exactly the same way. You'll just be using staples to hold it down instead of glue. Anyway, once that side was done, I had to secure down the stretch side, and this side is a little bit more tricky to get it sprayed in the right spot, but placing the cardboard an inch or so away from the lines and then folding it over worked pretty well for me. And then after I let it sit for 3 minutes to set up, I took the puller tool and stretched out the felt. And I lined up the marks I made before with the edges of the side pocket and the top edge of the slate. And when stretching it here, it works best to pull it straight out and then down over the side. And you can also see here that the felt is bunched up in the center where that side pocket is, but that's how it's supposed to be because it'll stretch out flat when we pull on the ends. Then moving to one of the corners, I used the tool in my right hand to stretch the felt straight back, and then at the same time I used my left hand to pull to the left and pull out the slack. Then I worked my way back to the center, pulling on the fabric every couple inches to make sure the lines were perfectly lined up and straight with the edge. And once I was finished with this side, I used the tool to press it down. And then I did the exact same thing on the other side. Also, the adhesive I used had about a 10-minute working time, so if I made any mistakes, there was plenty of time to correct them. Anyway, once both long sides are glued down, some people go and cut out the center pockets, and others just move on to the ends and leave those for last, which is what I did. And it doesn't matter which end you do first. I did the same thing with the glue and cardboard, trying not to make any mess. And then for folding this side over, first I stretched out and lined up the center. I got that stuck down and then moved on to a corner. Basically the same as the other corners, but here, instead of just pulling out the slack, we're actually going to stretch it out a bit. Pull straight out with the tool, and then with the other hand, pull it out diagonally from the corner pocket. Once I had a corner set, I worked my way to the center, and then did the same thing with the other side. And to finish this end off, I made sure it was all stuck down really well. And then on this end, I did the exact same thing as before, but this time I pulled it as hard as I could. It's really important that this side is stretched to the max, because if it's not, you might end up with wrinkles on your table. And there we go, then it was pretty much finished. All that was left to do is cut off the excess felt and then finish out the pocket. And even if you use staples on the rest of the table, you are still going to want to use glue on the pockets. Now for cutting these, I have seen some people measure it out, but the quickest and easiest way is to just cut it in half and then cut those halves in half. Of course, cutting it low enough so it won't show on the front side of the slate. And cutting it less is better because you can always cut it more if you need. Then I laid out some cardboard, folded those cuts up and over it, and sprayed the side of the slate as well as the bottom of the slate. And when spraying here, I really had to be careful because if it missed, it might end up on the tabletop. Anyway, after letting the glue sit for 3 minutes, I took the 2 center tabs, pulled them tight, and then folded them under the slate with my thumbs. I wasn't quite sure how to trim these side pieces, but I kind of just cut it until it looked like it would work, and then I folded them under the slate and just pressed all the pieces down. And honestly, I think think it turned out pretty well, and it was definitely easier than I thought it was going to be. And the corner pockets are pretty much the same, but they're even simpler. So again, I cut it into 4 pieces and then folded them up over a piece of cardboard. This time I used some tape to hold the strips out of the way, and this way I could actually spray the bottom of the felt as well. And yeah, then I folded them in like before and trimmed off the corners. I will mention, on a couple of these corners, I did spray a little bit too much of the adhesive, or maybe I just didn't wait long enough for it to set up, but the adhesive did actually leak through the felt a little bit. Luckily though, I had some acetone close by, and I was able to clean it up with that and a toothbrush. And it probably wasn't necessary, but I took some pieces of Gorilla Tape and put them under the pocket, just to be sure that the tabs wouldn't come loose. And after that, the slate was completely covered, and it was ready to put back together. And I forgot to show the time here, but it took me almost 2 hours to do the top. And I think it turned out really great. It's nice and tight, and there's no wrinkles on the top. There is this one spot on the top, though, that I'm really not happy with, and that's this glue splatter here. Unfortunately, I didn't notice it in time, so I couldn't quite get it perfect when I tried to clean it up. But it's difficult to see unless you're looking for it, and it's a home table, so it's no big deal. Anyway, the next step was to put it all back together, so that's exactly what I did. I lowered the slate down back onto the frame, 1 2x4 at a time, and then I lined it up so it would be exactly where it was before, and then I got some help to put the wood rails back into place. I screwed it back on from the sides as well as the underside, then I slid the ball collection chamber back into place and laid out the rail. And since they were numbered, they easily fit right back into their spots, and I screwed them on with no issues. After it was all put back together, I cleaned up and also used some wax and shined up the wood rails because they were looking a bit dull. From start to finish, it took me 5 hours and 47 minutes, and I think if I did it again, I could probably do it in 2.5 to 3 hours. Overall, I'm really happy with how the table turned out, especially for my first time doing it. The overspray on the top is pretty disappointing, but that could have easily been avoided. And apart from that, the top is nice and tight, the rails are also nice and tight, there's no ripples anywhere on here. I'm also really happy with this color, and the felt I used was really easy to work with. So if you're looking to take on the task of refinishing your pool table yourself, then I'd highly recommend it. It was honestly much easier than I thought it would be, and sure, it may not be up to professional standards, but I think it looks pretty good and it plays just fine.